Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Silk Stocking Sisters podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Teresa J. Canada. And in today's episode, I want to go over the topic of Puerto Ricans in the New York City Public Schools in the 1960s and 1970s. A fight for their children. That's what this topic is titled for this particular episode. So, I talk about a lot of different issues with the North and the Midwest, and this is a significant issue because people need to know about as much as they can so they'll know where we need to go. So let me give you a little history, and I have a little help. There's some research, significant research for this particular episode, which will still be pretty brief, and you're gonna have to do your own research on your own to get more, but I just wanna give you a little understanding about what was happening in New York City, specifically with the Puerto Rican population in New York City at the time. So let me give you a little background. First of all, I want to reference to some Madeline Perez and Anthony De Jesus. They wrote an article or part of a journal in City University of New York. I think it's Hunter College. I think they were at the time in 2009. And so some of my research came from this particular article they wrote about the Puerto Ricans and their efforts to have their education and their language included as part of their educational procedure. So like I said, let me just move forward with this. Let me give you a little background. So this particular topic relates to what was it and what happened. At just post-World War II, for those of you who don't know your history, post-World War II, the migration of Puerto Ricans to the United States mainland, and in particular New York City, introduced a new issue related to city schools and what was happening politically in New York City public schools. And that, according to this article and research, it was that of language rights. And of course, there's a linkage to everything else that was going on at the time in New York City and the country, specifically as it dealt with, schooling, public schooling, and dealing with the multiracial issues, multicultural issues, and a multilingual city and a nation, okay? So this migration from the South for Black residents, combined with the migration of Puerto Ricans from the mainland to the mainland, was converged into New York City. So you had a huge population of individuals coming in the New York City schools. All right. So let me just say, give you some example of how many people, pretty much. So there was an article that was written in 1960 by Nathan Glazer. He talks about, is integration possible in New York City? Now, of course, my book talked about the 1960s as well, mid-1960s. And I talked about my experience, as you see in, my book was talking about my experience and my classmates and others probably, but this is just documentation of what I talked about with the people who I interviewed for my book. But basically in 1960s, there was a lot of discrimination still taking place in the country, and it wasn't any different in New York City than it was any place else, even though it was the North, okay? But the key was there was a large number of Black and Puerto Ricans who were in New York City at the time. So, for example, the most important thing to understand about how do you integrate, it's only integrated when it's majority non-brown to Black, right? So just to give you some idea, according to this particular article, it said that 3/4 of school children of Manhattan are Black and Puerto Rican. Now, Manhattan is one of the 5 boroughs of New York City. You have 5 boroughs: Manhattan, Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island. So Manhattan is the base, I shouldn't say favored, but basically it has where, it's like the main, people think of in New York City, you think about Manhattan. They don't necessarily think about the other boroughs as often or as much. And some of that's changed a little bit still. Manhattan is like the main place people talk about in the city. They think about Manhattan, okay? So there were, at the time, in the 1960s, okay, so because of this migration that had been taking place for Blacks coming from the South, and also when Puerto Ricans coming, to the mainland from Puerto Rico, you had 3/4 of the school children, in Manhattan alone, just in Manhattan, in the borough of Manhattan, were Black and Puerto Rican. And 2/5 of those school children of greater New York, meaning all the boroughs included, were Black and Puerto Rican. 2/5 of all the school children during the 1960s were Black and Puerto Rican. That was significant, all right? So if you thought about, quote unquote, a busing process and signing pupils to different kinds of parts of the city, this is what this particular article talked about. And according to this article, this is what would have to happen. If you take the children of Brooklyn and put them into Queens, the children from Manhattan into the Bronx, and then, bring the children of Bronx and Queens into Brooklyn and Manhattan, et cetera, Black and Puerto Rican children as a whole, and this was based upon the 1960s numbers, Black and Puerto Rican children would make up 2/5 of every school in the New York City as a whole. 2/5. That's how large the population was of Black and Puerto Ricans in the city of New York at that time, right? So it was significant. So that's very important to know. So what was happening, they're trying to integrate the schools. They're trying to integrate schools. But what was happening, and from my point of view is that, many of the parents decided to, quote unquote, white flight, they call it. They were leaving the city and they were going to the suburbs. I talked about that a little bit in previous podcasts. And they decided to, leave the city. So therefore, places like the school the one I left was overcrowded, which is one of those Black and Puerto Rican, predominantly Black and Puerto Rican schools. And I was then sent to PS6, which was not a predominantly Black or Puerto Rican school. And it probably had more seats available because some of the people in that neighborhood may have been taking their kids out to the private schools or moving out of the district or moving out of the city. All right. So that was happening. So now with that occurring, like from 1940s and 60 until, between 1940 and 1960s, Black and Puerto Rican immigration in New York was met with rampant racism. There's no question. There wasn't like a welcome mat putting out. So, the federal housing authorities, they held up the guidelines. They had a residential segregation. And as we all know, that's called redlining. All right. That was occurring. Not that much has changed, but that was occurring very frequently because, basically, neighborhoods were rated on a scale. So, the lower the rating given to the communities, the higher the share of Black people living there who are residents or Black and Puerto Ricans. So, and banks refused to loan money to Black homeowners or Puerto Rican homeowners on any regular basis. And landlords, were still discriminating against Black and Puerto Rican people for renting, because they don't want to, lose leverage for their neighborhood ratings. Okay. So as a result, there were places that only Black and mostly Puerto Ricans lived. And those schools where their kids attended the schools were overcrowded. All right. Black and Puerto Rican neighborhoods and schools became overcrowded, yet the same zoning rules that were taking place was taking place in the city. Nothing changed. All right. Now, according to an article on a new information I found, I can't remember the research, but anyway, there's some citations that are available about the history of segregation in New York City school. I've done some of the research down from the archives, but basically, I talk about what was happening with the Board of Education and what led to Dr. Kenneth Clark's and how they decided to have this committee of integration in New York City Public Schools to try to integrate the schools, which was kind of like after the fact from when I went to PS6. It was maybe the very next year, I think 1964. So anyway, the Board of Education's, answer to the overcrowding in schools in Black and Puerto Rican neighborhoods was to implement most likely part-time school days. And the older schools that most of them were attending were becoming more and more deteriorated, okay? So the city just let them deteriorate. Now, I showed a video not too long ago. We have a previous video that I took of my previous elementary school from kindergarten to third. And I took a video, and it was out, I actually was one of my out in the street kind of videos, which was interesting. I took another video of my PS6 school. Well, guess what? PS6 still exists, and it's still a very well-kept building and school and very prestigious school to this day. And PS 157, which was my Harlem school, of course, it was converted to a residential. It's still a very beautiful structure. So they've done a fabulous job. It would have been a beautiful school, but they didn't invest in the facilities because it was an old school. And I have a history to talk about PS6, the building and everything. on a previous episode, so go check it out. So learn more about my PS 157 in Harlem. The building still exists. It was renovated, and now it's a housing development, the building itself. So good for them. Okay, so the building structure is still there, and they've upgraded it. But it was a beautiful school to me as a child. I was only there from kindergarten to third grade, but it was in a neighborhood, and that's where you attended the school, in your neighborhoods. So basically, what the Board of Education did when you have all these Black and Puerto Rican students at the time in the 60s, they didn't care about the conditions, and of course, the schools were overcrowded. The school that I was attending in Harlem was overcrowded. So they wanted to send some of us out of the schools, and we didn't take the yellow school buses, but we were chosen, I think, for PS6. We were chosen in some of these places to go to PS6, and were able to fill the coffers so they would make sure that they had enough students in their classrooms. But it was overcrowded in most of the schools that were where Black and Puerto Ricans mostly lived. So that gives you some indication of what it can happen with the quality of schooling and how they thought about the schools. So let me just also now, because of this influx and this concern for the Puerto Rican population to make sure they get language rights and to, basically deal with, what was happening in the city during this period of time with a large influx, of migration to the mainland from Puerto Rico. According to this article from the Hunter College researchers, it says the organizing and political activity of Puerto Rican New Yorkers during this period resulted in unprecedented policies, structures, and institutions designed to fully incorporate Puerto Ricans and other Latinos into the economic and political life of the city. That's end of quote. And it did, in fact, make a difference, okay? But what was happening in the schools, okay? What was happening, all right? Of course, not much change. And this is like a 2009 article. But basically what was happening is that there was a huge number of high school dropouts, okay? High dropouts as a whole, not just in high school, but dropping out of school as a whole, okay? It was just difficult. And, many people were excluded from schools that were maybe close to them or whatever. And so basically, based upon the civil rights, things that were happening with civil rights in this era for Black people, a group of Puerto Rican leaders created a grassroots, of trying to now think about what was happening to Puerto Rican, children. So, and other areas related to the Puerto Rican population and residents, okay? So there are three I'll mention, but the two I'm going to focus in on very briefly. The organizations, there were legal advocacy organization that was going to help to, basically help shape a more inclusive and responsive structure for the city schools. All right. And these organizations included Aspira, United Bronx Parents, UBP, and the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Education Fund. Now, each organization had different strategies. They're very different, but their overall goal was to address the issues that were happening with the Board of Education. That was what it was called in New York City, the Board of Education, and also to respond to how the Brown decision, 1954, would impact and provide appropriate service for English language learners. And that included people who spoke Spanish or any other language, but in this case, Spanish-speaking populations. Now, out of the ones that I just mentioned, these three organizations I mentioned, there are two of the organizations that became a large part, emerged because the founders of these organizations were parents, Puerto Rican parents, who, were being blamed for their children's educational problems. And those two organizations were Aspira and United Bronx Parents. And hopefully maybe I can get in touch with the Aspira, I think is still in business, and I'll see if I can reach out, maybe get someone from that organization to talk about the history and the funding, the foundation of Aspira and what they're doing now. But right now, I just wanted to share with you the information about the organizations that exist. Now, the founders of these organizations, they basically talked about problems that were inherent to Puerto Rican students, but that wasn't the goal. The goal was looking at the school system itself. They were saying that the school system was failing Puerto Rican children. This is what they said. Now, I'll tell you the names of the two people if I can pronounce these correctly. The founder of the United Bronx Parents was Evelina Lopez Antonetti. Okay, she was the founder of United Bronx Parents. I believe that, of course, is in the Bronx. And the founder of Aspira was Antonia Pantoja. I can't pronounce that. She was a social worker, and she was the founder of Aspira. So I'll get more details. You can check it out yourself, or send me a text. Send me a comment in the comment section, and I'll give you more information. But those are the two organizations I just want to mention specifically that were really at the forefront. And of course, the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund is still in business now, but much of the education stuff took place at that time with the United Bronx Parents and Evelina Lopez Antonetti, who was very much in charge right at the forefront, and Aspira, which is still now in existence at this point. So, long story short, what happened? Eventually, because of the movement, people getting involved, more politically involved, more Puerto Ricans getting politically involved, the New York City Board of Education, which it was called at the time, created a new department, I should say office in a sense. And it was established, called the Office of Bilingual Education, which was to address the issues that were taking place with people, specifically the Spanish-speaking population in the schools. And it was headed by someone named Hernan Lafontaine. I believe that's how you pronounce his name. And apparently, Mr. Lafontaine was an assistant principal involved with another issue dealing with what happened with IS 201, how they wanted to build, a junior high school that would be, involve, people from Spanish Harlem and then combined with Harlem, which was an experimental district. They tried to, develop districts, and they figured it was instrumental. Anyway, he was the former assistant principal of that particular school, IS 201. Okay, and what happened once he left there, he went on to found PS 25, a public school 25 in the Bronx. And PS 25 was the first bilingual school in New York City in 1968. Check it out, folks. They had a bilingual school in the New York City schools in 1968, and it was PS 25 in the Bronx. PS 25 was a successful and celebrated bilingual school. It ended up serving as a citywide model for bilingual education. So it was a very historic school. So it set the model for how the New York City Board of Education saw how you can work with bilingual education, how it can succeed. So basically, I just wanted to share with you a little bit about what was taking place in the New York City schools for Puerto Rican students and what the efforts were being made, which were very similar. But as you can see, where are we now? I mean, it's still, we've kind of resegregated again, but the basis is that you attended school near where you lived. And if the system wasn't going to prepare or, upgrade the standards in the school or facilities and so forth and so on, because the other key piece was that these schools that were in the Puerto Rican and Black new communities were basically had the most inexperienced teachers, and some of them were not even, certified to teach. And many of them didn't stay. They would wait and have a chance to come into the school, and then they would leave once they got a chance to get to another school. So, and they also didn't have the same resources for the schools that they had in some other neighborhoods. So I'm just saying this is an interesting piece, and I think we'll hear from somebody one of my guests who was a Puerto Rican also from a northern city, and you get a chance to hear her perspective about what happened to her and how she ended up going to her schools and what was able, once she had an opportunity to attend school and have the support that she needed, how she was able to excel, all right? So anyway, thank you for taking a few moments to be here with me to talk about this particular topic. Give me a thumbs up, subscribe, let me know what you think about this topic, and hopefully we'll see you again on I'll see you. I won't see you again, but hopefully you'll be back on the line again, and you'll check out future episodes of the 1960’s podcast. So have a good day, have a good night, good evening, wherever you are around the world, around the city, around the state, around the country, and we'll see you next time. Bye now.